Okay, so I am happy my name is Matthew Roth. I am the coordinator for the Nabokov Online Seminars and currently the vice president of the International Vladimir Nabokov Society. And I'm really thrilled to have two presenters with us today for our second of our two PhD spotlights. So I'm going to introduce them one at a time. And so I'll introduce our first presenter, and then she will present, and then I'll do the same with our second, and then we'll have a time for questions and answers and conversation at the end. So our first presenter today is Anoushka Alexander-Rose. She is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Heidelberg and research associate at the Winchester School of Art. Her current project explores the Wandering Jew and other migratory myths in the visual and literary arts and will culminate in an exhibition at the Winchester Gallery in 2027. She completed her PhD, Vladimir Nabokov's Jewish Muse, in English, at the Parks Institute for the Study of Jewish Non-Jewish Relations at the University of Southampton in July 2025. Additionally, she's involved in several research projects related to cultural heritage, minority representation, and diasporic arts. She's published on Vladimir Nabokov's father and philo-Semitism, multiple book reviews in comparative literature and history, and a forthcoming article on the Wandering Jew. So, Anoushka, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Matt. It's very exciting to be part of this. And as I was saying to Matt before, this is a good excuse for me to actually look at my PhD again since I submitted my corrections. Luckily, not too horrifying an experience. I'm going to do a kind of mishmash from my introduction and my conclusion with like a key example that I'll look at with you. And hopefully that will give a nice overview of the project. With some kind of more close reading as well. So I will share this. Hopefully it works. Yes. Is it full screen? Perfect. Right. In The Jew in the Text, Linda Nochlin reflects on the historic hatred of Jews, stating that, quote, only mutually exclusive categories would seem large enough to encompass the totality of our iniquity. A language of excess seems the natural vehicle for such vileness. However, she points to isolated examples in art and literature which suggest there is more than an essential Jewish identity waiting to be discovered, such as the deliberate refusal of narrative simplicity offered by Joyce and Proust. In this thesis, I ask whether Nabokov can be invited into that conversation. I do not ask whether he may join the ranks necessarily of these ostensibly sensitive literary predecessors, and neither am I satisfied in simply exposing the use of reductive caricature in his works. As Nochlin suggests, what we are interested in here is not some real, essential Jewishness lurking beneath the surface of lies and cliché, a reduced essence beyond the excessiveness of the stereotypical Jewish persona of art, literature, and propaganda, but rather that excessiveness itself, the almost hysterical repetitiveness of myths and exaggerations, black or white, and the ambivalent fluctuations between these two poles. Here I present a study of that excessiveness, hysterical repetitiveness, and ambivalent fluctuations as evidenced throughout Nabokov's fiction, and in doing so reject the binary so often embedded in narratives of representation. Nochlin also proposes that much of the position of the artist, Jewish or non-Jewish, more or less sympathetic to Jews, neutral or hostile, as well as the position of the viewer in relation to represented Jewishness. Across his life and his writings, Nabokov embodies all of these positions. He is straightforwardly, of course, a non-Jew, born into a family of noble and liberal Russian intelligentsia. Yet his Jewish wife and son afford him some intimate insight into this identity, and more abstractly, the same may be said for his position as a writer in the modern era. Neil Levy explores the presentation of modernist art and literature as Jewish, addressing how many thinkers such as Levinas, Derrida, and Bauman, whose theories will be explored in the thesis, identify in Jews and Judaism a kind of, quote, zone of purity, a sublime other. Many commentators extend this sublime otherness to literary modernism, interpreting figures such as Joyce and Beckett as Judaic or non-Jewish Jewish writers. I include this to situate the theoretical and literary influences, both for Nabokov and for myself, at the slippery intersection of Jewish non-Jewish, and consider how the question of Jewish representation is particularly ubiquitous for these thinkers. Beyond, in the arena of modernist writing and thinking, Jewishness is uniquely placed to speak at the emergence of a temporal and intellectual indeterminacy. Claims to ownership of such identity are collapsed, accommodating, and even encouraging to non-Jewish insight and contribution. Traditionally, Nabokov has been described as sympathetic to Jews, even an anti-Semite in his protestations against Nazism and individual instances of allyship. Yet in my understanding, his motivations present a more complex picture. Vladimir Jabotinsky defines asemitism as the disinterested desire to be free of the unwanted element in one's own social circles. Is disinterest an absence of interest or its antithesis? Alternatively, Nabokov's neutrality can be found in his self-fashioned ivory tower, a stubborn refusal to engage publicly in matters of history and politics. We may even detect an undercurrent of hostility in his jealousy of how Jewish contemporaries adjusted to life in exile with relative ease, tapping into existing networks and essential nomadism and foreignness. Simultaneously, he places himself in opposition to Jewishness, the exemplar of difference, yet cannot resist mining Jewish experience of migration, multilingualism, or otherworldliness as a way of expressing himself. Nochlin concludes her essay with an appeal to problematize the vexed issue of representing Jews or Jewishness by pointing out the multiplicity of possible meanings and the variety of interpretive strategies at the disposal of both authors and audience. Indeed, even with the work of a single author, admittedly Nabokov being extremely prolific, Jewishness is represented in a multiplicity of ways, which can be read using multiple interpretive models. This notion draws on Bauman's coinage Allosemitism, which he defines as a radically ambivalent attitude. It does not unambiguously determine either hatred or love of Jews, but contains the seeds of both, and assures that whichever of the two appears is intense and extreme. There is a resonance, quote, between the intellectual and emotional ambivalence of Allosemitism and the endemic ambivalence of the other, the stranger, and consequently the Jew as a most radical embodiment, the epitome of the latter. This thesis is ordered to principally reflect the evolution of Nabokov's life and work. Along these biographical lines, I unpack and challenge established assumptions related to Nabokov's father's philo-Semitism, the influence of his wife Vera, and the implications of Nabokov's integration into a wider Jewish milieu in literary and academic worlds. This thesis asks how these historical, personal, and intellectual dimensions inform Nabokov's writing about Jewishness and seeks to characterize his representation of otherness across multiple types. Moreover, it considers how Jewishness acts as a muse, representing indeterminacy in exile, the slipperiness of language, the guises and shades of sexuality, and what it means to be at the borders of past and present, history and modernity, East and West. In choosing a title, I was searching for a term which could capture the blurring of the real and the abstract Jew in Nabokov's imaginary, and which addressed its fundamental ambivalence, incorporating the author's tendency to other Jewishness, yet also to remain close to it. Maxim Schreier has used the term Jewish muse specifically to describe Vera, yet I widen this to apply the muse to Jewishness as a total yet abstract concept, which serves multiple functions, including as inspiration. This is informed by Adele Tutter's reframing of the classic tradition of the 9 muses through psychoanalytical perspectives, as a figure of ambivalence who exists in contrast to the self-other, self-artist even, or self-other, I guess. Undoubtedly, the muse is feminized and sexualized both in its origin and its subsequent social and cultural manifestations. Its creative powers lie in the ambivalent space between maternal instinct and erotic seduction. Whilst I use the muse more widely to characterize the function of Jewishness for Nabokov as an author, I nevertheless recognize the extent to which this is gendered, considering the double otherness of the Jewish women in his work. A passage from Look at the Harlequins best exemplifies the commonalities between the traditional feminine muse and the role of the Jew. The protagonist, Vadim, is describing himself being haunted. In those days, I seem to have had 2 muses, the essential, hysterical, genuine one, who tortured me with elusive snatches of imagery and wrung her hands over my inability to appropriate the magic and madness offered to me, and her apprentice, her palette girl in stand-in, a little logician, who suffered the torn gaps left by her mistress with explanatory or meter-mending fillers, which became more and more numerous the further I moved away from the initial evanescent, savage perfection. Vadim's muses represent the tension between the impossible pursuit for truth in art and its much more plausible yet deficient product, illustrating the brutality of writing. The task is to capture something essential, hysterical, and genuine in initial, evanescent, savage perfection. This, of course, chimes with my own discussion of the challenges of representing the real Jew beyond the imagined other. However, Vadim's admission of his inability to appropriate the magic and madness offered suggests an authorial awareness that such savage perfection might not be his to write about, or that it may belong to the natural subject rather than the chronicler. This struggle is central to the question of the representation of Jewishness in Nabokov. What does it mean to be Jewish, let alone to have Jewishness written about, or to read a text Jewishly? Is such a thing possible, appropriate, necessary? Moreover, it invites attention to the process rather than the product, returning to Nochlin's interest in excessiveness itself. My thesis seeks to answer these questions across 4 chapters, which each speak to different dimensions of Jewishness in Nabokov's works as various types: the other, the Jewess, the vulgarian, and the helper. Chapter 1 considers Nabokov's earliest encounters with the other, investigating the challenges of representation between the empirical and the essential in Derrida's terms. The first part explores previously unstudied figures from the author's childhood and their fictional counterparts. In Encounters with the Other, I present a study of Nabokov's tutor, Philip Zelensky, who the author recalls in his memoirs Speak Memory and De Rugia Berega, through a vernacular of linguistic and pathological otherness, which I situate in a long history of Jewish difference through body and language. This is followed by Nabokov's geography teacher at the Tenishev School, Nikolai Berezin, who appears in a poem as a figure of Jewish caricature and later fictionalizes Berezovsky in Orash and The Gift. Berezin comes to represent Nabokov's engagement with the concept of the other world via the intersections of specifically Jewish levity as a way to mediate tragedy, such as the death of the father figure. Both Lenski and Berezin act as muses in their role as intellectual or spiritual guides, carving a path for Nabokov into an awareness of the wider world. The second part of the chapter turns to Letters to Vera and introduces Freud's humor theory as a way to read Nabokov's attempts to access the other or be in on the joke. Finally, I showcase instances of unmasking the other, in which Nabokov draws on a familiar set of shibboleths or markers to find and expose Jewishness in order to further demonstrate his familiarity. In chapter 2, I present the Jewess, the ultimate muse and double other, beginning by problematizing the figure of Mrs. Vladimir Nabokov, drawing on Vera's reflections on her own Jewish identity to challenge existing assumptions about the influence she had on her husband. Then I intersect existing typologies used to characterize Nabokov's female characters as developed elegantly by Elena Rachimova-Summers with the theories of the Jewess from Belle Juive to Juive Fatale, situating these tropes in the Russian literary canon. In particular, intertextual references to Salome and Sarah Bernhard indicate how Nabokov engages with a tradition of representing the Jewess as a vehicle for sexual threat. This chapter also presents studies of 5 Jewesses found in Nabokov's works. I begin with Clara from Mary, a hitherto neglected character whose identity in the text is hidden behind shibboleths despite Nabokov describing her in a letter to his mother as a Kievan Jewess. My analysis establishes the significance of her character and demonstrates how her representation is indebted to a tradition which views the Jewess as physically abject, emotionally excessive, and sexually dysfunctional. Next, I draw on my reconstruction of Vera to reread The Gift's heroine Zina, characterizing her as an ideal Jewess, considering her shame in admitting one's origins and comparing her with other Jewish women in the novel. I present 3 Salome types, Vera from the real life of Sebastian Knight, and Rita and Flora from Ardor, whose speculative identities fit with the type of the physically seductive or even deviant Jewess. In addition to a procuress, Frau Landowski from Laughter in the Dark. These are countered by another set of ciphers who exist to express Jewish tragedy, predominantly from Nabokov's short stories of the 1930s, as well as Penin with Mira Bolochkin. As mourners and victims, they suffer for the sake of the plot, their experience is secondary to the role of emotional guide they played for the protagonist. Finally, I turn to Nabokov's final Jewess, Iris Black. Much like Clara, she's been paid little attention in scholarship, yet represents a composite of multiple types, othered through linguistic difference, orientalized, made sexually deviant, shameful about her Jewishness, and instrumentalized for the sake of the male subject. This study offers the first intersection of the two identities of Jewish and women from Nabokov's earliest to final novel, employing close and intertextual reading to demonstrate the range of representations of this double other. Whilst the first two chapters draw on Jewish figures from Nabokov's life and fiction, Chapter 3 showcases how Nabokov uses Jewishness not to form a character, but as a litmus test in shaping the construction of the Vulgarian. I begin by situating Nabokov's definition of poshlost amongst other conceptions of the term from Russian cultural and intellectual history, demonstrating how the author applies this more broadly to act as an indicator of taste, challenging existing scholarship which views it as a marker of the author's resistance to anti-Semitism. I then map intertextual references to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which Nabokov first encountered via Kalashnikov at Cambridge and came to understand as contextualized amongst other Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracies as an example of bad reading. In close analyses of short stories from Lick, the assistant producer, and the Admiralty Spire, I argue how Nabokov draws on anti-Semitic qualities to construct vulgar or Pushlaki characters. In particular, he turns back to the language of Imperial Russian Judeophobia to speak to the contemporary political landscape, highlighting themes of artificiality, unreliability, and conspiracy. To further demonstrate his definition of vulgarity through the lens of Poshlost, I offer a study of his portmanteau Pogromistic, which engages the memory of a particular Jewish experience of tragedy to speak more widely to fascist ideologies. As a postscript, I turn to the evolution of Poshlost after the Holocaust. I address Lolita's Holocaust subtext in The Humbug Problem, exploring how Nabokov problematizes and weaponizes the pairing of Jewishness and blackness whilst writing to a new American audience, and consider the implications of this approach for the balance between aesthetics and ethics. Finally, I scrutinize the oft-quoted scene from Pale Fire, in which John Shade compares the Jasmine Belt lyncher and the mystical anti-Semite to conclude how Nabokov employs the semantics of race to construct his post-war Poshlost. Finally, Chapter 4 continues to explore Nabokov's American context and consider the pairing and instrumentalizing of Jewish and Black others through the type of the helper, drawing on Leonid Livek's generative model of meek and defenseless do-gooders, and is situated in historic entanglements of these identities in the racialized imaginary. Having established the significance of the Wandering Jew in Nabokov's oeuvre, I determine how the inventor and Silberman from the author's pre-war writings contribute to a particular type which exists to serve the protagonist through spiritual or otherworldly knowledge. I then apply these characteristics to the synesthetic type of the magical Negro, wherein the Wandering Jew of Nabokov's Russian works becomes literally the black help of his American corpus, as with Kimbert's Gardener and the help in Lolita, showcasing the mutability of the other. Continuing my study of Panin, I offer a rereading of the squirrel motif through the theory of creaturely poetics, suggesting how Nabokov intersects Jewish and Black experiences through the non-human to express more universal notions of tragedy. This chapter ends with a study of Jack Humberson, whose racial indeterminacy and absence of function exemplifies how Nabokov brings together the Wandering Jew and the magical Negro as helpers and essential signifiers of otherness. My conclusion in the thesis and also of the talk returns to look at the Harlequins, which I argue epitomizes Nabokov's lifelong entanglement with the Jewish muse, incorporating many avenues and demonstrating the centrality of this motif. Having sojourned in the territory of the magical Negro in his American fiction, in this final novel he returns to the enduring Wandering Jew. To help him re-establish contact with his estranged daughter, Vadim is introduced to, quote, an old respectable businessman, I shall call him A.B., with a note saying that he was in textiles, though by education an engineer, that he represented a Soviet firm in the US and vice versa. He was a superb little man, perfectly oval in shape, with a bald head and tiny feet expensively shod. The rest of his envelope looked less classy. He spoke friable English with a soft Russian accent and native Russian with Jewish question marks. He thought that I should begin by seeing Dora. He settled for me the exact spot where she and I might meet. He warned me that in preparing to visit the weird wonderland of the Soviet Union, a traveller's first step was the very Philistine one of being assigned a nomer, hotel room, and that only after he had been granted one could the visa be tackled. Over the tawny mountain of Bogdan's brown-speckled butterscotch caviar-accompanied blini, which AB forbade me to pay for, though I was lousy with the kingdom's money, he spoke poetically and at some length about his recent trip to Tel Aviv. Like the Wandering Jew, he is unnamed, of indeterminate origin, defined by physical caricature and linguistic difference as exposed by the protagonist. He refuses to accept financial compensation and possesses vague employment history. However, far from the travelling salesman of the interwar period and refugees escaping Nazism, Nabokov adapts to a new geopolitical context, responding to the wave of Soviet Jewish migration in the 1970s. AB is, quote, in Riga till the end of the month and has 4 nephews in Israel, end quote. He is a contemporary, cosmopolitan, Cold War-era wandering Jew and even a suspected spy. Invoking the Latvian capital, a site of Jewish national activism in this period, and the centre of Zionist refusing movement, Nabokov references the suspected double loyalty of Soviet Jews to their homeland and to the Holy Land. Yet AB also has an American sensibility, a Philip Rothian quality of self-deprecation and dry humour. It is of course significant that at the time of writing and in the wake of the Yom Kippur War, Nabokov was becoming vocal in his support for the Israeli state, although much motivated by his contempt for so-called Arab Bolshevism. The references in the novel go beyond the Wandering Jew. Vadim's first wife, Iris Black, is written in the image of Proust's half-Jewess Gilberte. In Iris's bedroom, Vadim comes across a curious French novel, Du Code de chez Swann, recalling the dynamic between Fyodor and Zina in The Gift. Whilst Nabokov mostly updates the semantics of Poshlos for the new generation of fictional characters, he still relies on the tried and tested shibboleths for his protagonist, exposing his familiarity and alliance with Jewishness alongside indicators of Poshlost. Whilst working on The Dare, Vadim comments, I knew it would be my longest novel. I did not foresee, however, that it would be almost as long as General Pudov's vile and fatuous historical romance about the way the Zion Wisers usurped St. Rus, an intellectual link to the protocols as referenced in The Gift. Later, Vadim receives a letter, apparently from his wife, in which she refers derisively to your black-locked friends. In his commentary, he disputes the authorship. My wife, coming as she did from an obscurant Russian milieu, was no paragon of racial tolerance, but she would never have used the vulgar anti-Semitic phraseology typical of her friend's character and upbringing, recalling the translation edits of the Admiralty Spire, which exposed Katya. Jacques, the gardener's boy, is a natural progeny of magical Negro, defined in relation to his sexual and domestic servitude. Finally, Nabokov invokes the brutal reality of the Holocaust as if part of the fabric of his narrative tendencies. Osip himself was to die when attempting a trepid escape, barefoot in blood-stained underwear, from the experimental hospital of a Nazi concentration camp. The most startling clue for Nabokov's good reader occurs when Vadim is confronted by a stranger who accuses him of selling out for an American audience. His attack refers to, quote, this obscene novelette about little Lola or Lottie, whom some Austrian Jew or reformed pederast rapes after murdering her mother. Vadim angrily refutes this. Is Nabokov pointing his readers towards the neglected subtext of Lolita, inviting questions about Humbert's ethnic origins? Or on the contrary, is he using his authorial mouthpiece to warn against such reading? Whichever it may be, Nabokov uses this novel as a way to reassert his authorial intentions, demonstrating the fundamental presence of Jewishness across his oeuvre. This thesis invites Nabokov into emerging conversations that seek to read his works against the grain, reparatively through history and psychoanalysis, and searching for the other in the text, but also into wider investigations which collapse the binaries of Jewish representation. Beyond these recent inquiries, and building on the groundwork of Leonid Livak, I consider not only how Nabokov uses Jewishness as a literary device, but I interrogate his methods and motivations for doing so. Johnson describes Look at the Harlequin's key theme as the mystery of personal identity and the transcendence of the self to be found in love and art. I posit that to demystify Nabokov's authorial and personal identity, it is necessary to notice and problematize his representation of Jewishness. His ambivalent affection for the mystique, which underpins his personal and aesthetic pursuit of an essential otherness, to find the key to the crypt, to use Derrida. That this otherness is fundamentally inexpressible is evident in Nabokov's reliance on an established lexicon to represent Jewishness. Yet, in diversity and scope, Nabokov is not wholly derivative or monotonous in his depiction of the Jew, as he consistently tests the limits of his own authorial imagination in attempts to find the threshold where initial evanescent savage perfection lies. It is necessary, and perhaps only possible, to conduct this study around Jewishness, an inimitable state of being that captures both Nabokov's private and authorial attention, by drawing on a long and troubled literary legacy. This makes the question of the Jew in Nabokov's fiction particularly urgent and thorny as it relates to the more fundamental and historical dilemma: what does it mean to be Jewish and to be seen as such? By illuminating the diversity and constancy of Nabokov's Jewish muse, we can develop a framework to apply to the wider problem of representation in his text and ask, what is the other? As evidence, these vehicles for difference often overlap. Racialized Jewishness and blackness are united in how Nabokov extracts their historical oppressions and fails to address their political realities. Some final gaping questions remain. Was Nabokov really so oblivious or superior to his own contradictions, when his representations so often are indeed troubling? Is this an imaginative deficiency or an indulgence of the taboo? Did he love Vera's Jewishness, a portal through which he could access or even become the other? Or did her assimilation satisfy and validate his own ambivalence? Whilst these questions are of course unanswerable, in this thesis I've been able to formulate and initiate a journey that takes account of such inquiries by demonstrating and characterizing Nabokov's relentless pursuit of the essential, hysterical, genuine Jewish muse. The representation of Jewishness is beyond his authorial reach, and it is this very ungraspability which dictates his anxious preoccupation.
Matt, you're muted.
Thank you. Was just saying to myself that it was a wonderful presentation, and it just raises so many interesting questions and makes me want to read everything that you have to say about it. So thank you so much for that, Anoushka. So we will move on to our second presenter. Julie Lesnoff is a research associate at the CRAL and PRISM Laboratories. She holds a PhD in aesthetics from EHESS Paris. She defended her doctoral dissertation on May 27, 2025. Her work focuses on the cinematic adaptation of metaphor, and more specifically on the case of metaphors in Nabokov's novel Lolita and their film adaptations by Kubrick and Line. Her current research extends to the cinema of David Lynch, which she studies through the prism of Nabokov's work. So Julie, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Matt. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here today to listen to a brief presentation of my PhD dissertation in philosophy of aesthetic entitled Lolita. I'm sorry, I must to share my screen. Can you see my?
We can see it.
Okay. And I'm trying to put it in full screen. Is it better?
Yep, perfect.
Perfect, thank you very much. So my PhD dissertation in philosophy of aesthetic entitled Lolita from Text to Screen, the Stakes of Cinematic Adaptation of Metaphor, which I completed under the supervision of Professor Marie Boucher and Professor Jean-Marie Schaeffer. To introduce my work, I will first go over the background and the questions that led me to undertake this research, in order to situate its general framework. Second, I will present the central research question, as well as the main theoretical and methodological issues it raises. Finally, I will discuss a more practical dimension of my work through the short example of film sequence, which will allow me to illustrate concretely the elements developed earlier. The question of the cinematic adaptation of metaphor first came to me while reading Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, one of the most frequently adapted novels for both cinema and television. The suicide of Anna Karenina is a well-known event, even for readers who have never opened the book. The tragic fate of this character, who threw herself under a train, is a striking image. And also, it is not the actual ending of the novel. Most film adaptations stop at this event. This led me to focus my master dissertation on the cinematic adaptation of Tolstoy's depiction of Anna's death, examining how filmmakers have adapted or sometimes neglected the network of proleptic metaphor Tolstoy carefully constructs in the suicide scene that you can read on the screen. At the end of this project, I wanted to pursue the question further because while there has been extensive research on cinematic adaptation on the one hand and on metaphor on the other, there is no work that specifically addresses the adaptation of metaphor from text to screen. My research thus raises a complex issue. Novels can be considered as open works, allowing for multiple interpretations, and it seems to me that metaphor concentrates this polysemy. And as a figure of displacement, it disseminates meanings and interpretations even further. This makes it a particularly rich subject of study, especially within the already complex process of cinematic adaptation. Indeed, a metaphor must first be recognized as such in the text by the reader in order to work, and only then can it potentially find a place in the film, or even more problematically, be perceived by the viewer. Finding a relevant corpus, however, was not easy. At first, I chose to work on Stanley Kubrick's, since he directed many literary adaptations. I had read Arthur Schnitzer's novella that inspired his last film, Eyes Wide Shut, but it did not strike me for its use of metaphor. I therefore needed a work in which metaphors were as striking as in Anna Karenina. This is how I began to work on Lolita and on its two film adaptations by Stanley Kubrick, 1962, and Adrian Lyne, 1987. Moreover, Adrian Lyne's films have received little academic attention, so it seems even more interesting to investigate. When I read Nabokov's Lolita, I realized just how rich in metaphors it is. This led me to wonder whether film adaptations could convey those metaphors with the same power. The question of metaphor in Lolita is more complex than in Anna Karenina, because the metaphors I focused on in Tolstoy's novel were central to the plot. For instance, the heroine's suicide, a crucial narrative event that directors could not omit. Furthermore, those metaphors were rather conventional, even cliché, like the light going out as a metaphor for death. In contrast, Nabokov's Lolita is filled with vivid, inventive metaphors that play a crucial role, as I aimed to show in my dissertation. Metaphor is a key rhetorical tool for the narrator Humbert Humbert. He uses it to disguise and obscure the crime he continually commits against Lolita. I was struck by how Humbert's metaphors functions almost performatively within the text, and I remember being deeply affected by one particular metaphor because of its formal beauty despite the horror it reveals. I felt proud of myself. I had stolen the honey of a spasm without impairing the morals of a minor. Absolutely no harm done. The conjurer had poured milk, molasses, foaming champagne into a young lady's new white purse, and lo, the purse was intact. For me, this metaphor is central to the novel because it crystallizes Humbert's violent desire and the assault he has just inflicted upon Lolita. It gave rise to several questions. How can such virtuosity be attributed to an untrustworthy narrator? Why grant such verbal creativity to a criminal? What dangerous proximity between author and character does Nabokov seek to establish, and to what end? This reflection led me to realize that metaphors in Lolita serve as a genuine rhetorical device used by the narrator to deceive and by the author to reveal. Indeed, in my dissertation, I argue that the metaphors in Lolita serve two main purposes. First, the rhetorical function. Humbert uses metaphors as a tool of manipulation. His pedantic, seductive style tries to convince the reader that his version of events is the truth. Following Lakoff and Johnson, I show that metaphors are not just decorative. They actually shape how we perceive reality. By imposing a metaphor, Humbert imposes his version of truth. He uses them to create what we might call fictional realities, masking the real violence of his actions behind poetic language. As Umberto Eco points out, a metaphor is, in a sense, a lie, used to say something else, and Humbert exploits this ambiguity to turn a story of abuse into a pseudo-love story. Second, the heuristic function. Metaphors also guide discovery. Nabokov uses them not only to mislead, but to help the reader uncover the hidden truth of the text. The ideal reader, he argues, must be both artistic and analytical, looking beyond the literal meaning. Even so, Humbert hides reality. The metaphor reveals the truth underneath, inviting the reader to interpret, decode, and reconstruct the meaning. This is one of the cornerstones of my dissertation, since it touches upon a crucial aspect of the novel, visible from its very title in the fictional preface by John Ray Jr., Lolita, or the Confessions of a White Widow Male. Behind this seemingly respectable narrator, as shaped by the norms of a white patriarchal American society, a cultured professor, an upper-class white man whose father owned a hotel, lies beneath the polished surface of metaphor a violent man, one who beats up his first wife, contemplates murdering his second wife, Dolores Hayes' mother, and is ultimately a rapist and a pedophile. Thus, while Humbert uses metaphor as veil to conceal his crimes, Nabokov invites readers to lift that veil, to perceive the nightmare hidden behind a seemingly enchanting story, in which Humbert will be the illusionist and Dolores Hayes the mesmerizing little nymphette. Moreover, metaphor is a quintessential poetic figure. Through it, Humbert seeks to place himself among his peers, certain great poets like Dante or Edgar Allan Poe, not only because he believes himself equally talented, but because they shared his desire for young girls. By aligning himself with them, Humbert absolves himself. If geniuses like Poe, Dante, or Petrarch loved a little girl, then surely it cannot be a crime. But Nabokov shows us the opposite, that we must beware of appearances, especially those of revered figures of art and literature, because just as Humbert's metaphor conceals Lolita's nightmare, brilliant appearances can hide monsters. In Nabokov's own screenplay for Lolita, metaphors are not omitted. For example, Humbert's arrival in Ramsdale is preceded by a storm. The terrible wind frightens Lolita, who locks herself in her room, recalling a metaphor from Poe's poem Annabel Lee, from which Humbert borrows extensively both in the novel and in the screenplay. That the wind came out of the cloud by night, chilling and killing my Annabel Lee. The storm, as a metaphorical bad omen, thus also references Poe and foreshadows Humbert's fatal intrusion into Dolores' life. But what happens to this metaphor in the film version of Lolita? The answer is complex. While the director seems to have adapted certain metaphors, they also made choices that obscure or neutralize their impact. One example discussed in chapter 4 of my PhD dissertation is the sofa scene, a pivotal moment in which Humbert assaults Dolores for the first time. Both Kubrick and Line adapted this scene, yet Line cut it entirely from his final edit, and Kubrick reimagined it through a different metaphor, portraying Lolita as a temptress and erasing Humbert's predatory aspect. This is a dynamic I explore further in my dissertation. I quickly show you this passage because it's a particularly interesting aspect. From then on, I analyzed this passage as an adaptation of the sofa scene in Nabokov's novel. In my opinion, Kubrick revisits this scene here through a somewhat humorous lens. The egg represents the apples that Lolita holds in the novel, and as you may have noticed, elements from Genesis are revisited metaphorically through Lolita's gesture of offering the egg to Humbert, like a temptress, while he pretends to resist. There is therefore a real mise en abîme through this gesture, as it mirrors the dynamic of their relationships in the movie. It is ultimately Lolita who dominates Humbert, not the other way around. Through various analyses, I realized how complex the reception of metaphor can be, and how overlooking the duality of the metaphor in Lolita, the tension between beautiful image and nightmare, can create a form of misreading, more precisely a misinterpretation. Adaptation theory has discussed this notion of misinterpretation, and during my thesis defense, one of the committee members, a film study professor, asked whether a misreading adaptation could surely exist. After all, every filmmaker is free in adaptation, and Lolita, as a novel, is itself open to multiple interpretations. However, in the case of Lolita, I argue that these are not simply the inevitable changes of medium, cuts or compressions, but rather a problematic reorientation of meaning, both ethically and narratively, that the two adaptations produce. Kubrick and Line's versions shift or even invert a fundamental tension in Nabokov's text, the tension between denouncing Humbert and adopting his point of view. The novel invites readers to remain critically aware of Humbert's manipulation, particularly through his use of metaphor, while the film tends to blur that critical distance. In this sense, we can indeed speak of an adaptation that misread its source, because the failure to adapt metaphors and the changes in focalization fundamentally alter the meaning, stakes, and ethical weight of the novel. As Nabokov himself insisted, Lolita carries a very moral, not to harm children. By introducing the notion of contresens, misreading, in my dissertation, I aim to take a critical stance. While adaptation always exists within a tension between fidelity, reinterpretation, and creative transformation, what translation scholar Stephen Samoyo calls a field of the impossible when referring to translation, the concept of contresens can serve as an analytical tool rather than a moral judgment. Drawing on statements from the filmmakers themselves, who described Lolita as a mutual love story, I use the notion of contresens or misinterpretation to explore how such readings contributed to the creation of the Lolita myth. On the PowerPoint, you can see two quotations supporting this point, one from Stanley Kubrick and one from Stephen Schiff, who wrote the screenplay for Adrian Lyne's version. This reciprocity is depicted in the film through shift in focalization and the staging of Lolita's gaze, which I would like to recall does not exist in the novel. This is why I will now give you another brief filmic example. I will discuss the scene in which Humbert first discovers Dolores Haze. I won't have time to analyze the full sequence, nor to show both films, but we will look at the text itself and then at the corresponding scene in Adrian Lyne's film, which is generally the lesser known of the two adaptations. We will therefore focus specifically on a metaphor used by Humbert when he first sees Dolores in Nabokov's novel and screenplay. We'll see that this metaphor reveals to the reader the mechanism of domination as fantasized by Humbert and imposed on Lolita. We'll examine Lyne's film where these metaphors are absent, which diminish Humbert's domination over Lolita as depicted in the novel. There is a metaphor in question. And if I was a fairy tale nurse of some little princess, lost, kidnapped, discovered in gypsy rags through which her nakedness smiled at the king and his hound, I recognized the tiny dark brown mole on her side. In this extract, Humbert used two metaphors, that of the nurse through the comparison, that of the king on the end. The figure of the nurse associated with that of the king illustrates the mechanism of domination that Humbert puts in place by positioning himself as a parental figure to Lolita, the only one left to her after her mother's death, but also as an authoritative figure, which the image of the king and his horde of hounds, also evoking the image of the hunter. Indeed, the nurse here may refer to Eurycleia, Odysseus' nurse, who recognized him by the scar on his foot, just as Humbert claims to recognize his former love Annabelle through the mole on Lolita's body. In Humbert's case, the nurse becomes a figure of incest. For the nurse is the one who raises, nourishes, and breastfeeds. She is a nurturing, educating, and protective figure by excellence. What's more, in Homer's epic, Odysseus is presented to the world by his nurse, Eurycleia, as the child Polluaretos, meaning the most desired child. By analogy, then, Humbert presents Lolita, as Eurycleia presents Odysseus, as this much desired child. Let us now watch the excerpt from the film. In this sequence, it becomes clear that none of the metaphors developed by Nabokov in the passage under analysis have found an equivalent in the film adaptation. This observation, essential within the framework of a study devoted to the cinematic transposition of literary metaphor, has also brought to light another equally crucial issue, that of point of view. Indeed, the novel relies on on a narrative structure centered on Humbert, an autodidactic and profoundly unreliable narrator who filters and distorts the perception of the world, particularly that of Lolita, whose subjectivity remained inaccessible. In this sequence, however, the use of a semi-subjective shot grants the spectator direct access to Lolita's own gaze and experience. This shift in point of view, absent from the source text, profoundly alters the dynamics of reception, often turning Lolita into a seeming accomplice of Humbert. In this thesis, I have shown that the film adaptations of Lolita fail to adopt a truly subjective point of view, leading the viewer to perceive the image and dialogue as the objective reality of the narrative. Yet, several narrative devices could have compensated for this absence. For instance, the inclusion of an external narrator or a prologue as Nabokov himself has envisioned in his own script. However, other filmmakers have successfully represented subjectivity through multiple perspectives, as in Ridley Scott's The Last Duel, which presents three versions of the same events which constitute rapes of a woman according to each protagonist's point of view. This technique, inherited from Kurosawa's Rashomon, illustrates what is known as the Rashomon effect, the coexistence of partial and contradictory truths depending on each individual's perception. Such an approach could have inspired the directors of Lolita, Kubrick and Line, especially since Kurosawa was among Kubrick's most admired filmmakers. By choosing not to employ this multiplicity of perspectives, these adaptations therefore reveal deliberate aesthetic and narrative decisions rather than changes imposed by the cinematic medium. By not adapting the novel's metaphor and by transforming the narrator's internal focalization into a multiple and shared one, these adaptations perform as kind of abuse against Vladimir Nabokov's novel Lolita. Through reading the novel, Lolita became what Humbert made her, a victim. Through the films, Lolita became what they made her, a guilty party. Thus was born the myth of Lolita. These are the reasons why I concluded my PhD thesis with this word. It's time to adapt Lolita for the cinema once again. Thank you for your attention. I'm sorry for my accent.
Thank you so much, Julie. Can you unshare your screen? There's probably some way I can do that, but thank you. That's perfect. Thank you so much. What again, another fascinating presentation, and just again, congratulations to you both on this achievement. And it's so exciting that we have young scholars who are continuing to do good work, new work, vital work on Nabokov. So we have some time here for questions and conversation. So if people want to use the hand raising function in Zoom, we can do it that way. You can get to see that under the React button on Zoom. You should be able to find the raised hand. And people can also put questions in the chat if need be. So somebody have a question to start off with? Well, while people are warming up, I'll start off. My question's for Anoushka. I'm just wondering, I really like this notion of, or found interesting this notion of excessiveness, how there tends to be this kind of radical ambivalence, which is not indifferent, but but actually it tends to, the pendulum tends to swing all the way towards one side or the other. And I'm wondering if, just as a matter of understanding through difference, are there examples of authors maybe from, I don't know, maybe contemporary authors or maybe authors from this period, non-Jewish authors who represent Jewishness in a way that avoids that excessiveness, just sort of as a counterexample that would help us to understand what some of the other possibilities might be, rather than this kind of excessiveness that Nabokov resorts to.
Thanks, Matt. I got a very similar question in my Viva, which was not about other authors, but basically what would Nabokov have to do to like it not be a thing worth studying? And I think I came up with like a very deficient response, which was that if a character sort of happens to be Jewish rather than is made Jewish for a particular reason, whether that reason is positive or negative, then they're just like any other character, rather than being like, oh, they are meant to add kind of exotic certain kind of trait. I think unfortunately, I don't know if I've ever come across an example where a character in a book by a non-Jewish author just sort of happens to be Jewish. And I also don't know whether that is the best. I don't know whether that is the opposite. I think the reason why it's so tricky with Nabokov is because he has this personal intimacy. So of course he writes what and who he knows, which is in the 20s and 30s, he is part of a Russian emigre milieu where more than half of the people that he's working with are Jewish. So of course, and that's what's interesting about the Letter Severe is how often he points out that someone is Jewish that he's met, but he doesn't point out if they're like Polish or Catholic or like any other kind of identity. And I don't know whether that's, obviously we don't have Vera's response, so I don't know whether that's like an in-joke they had where she kind of liked to be told if there was someone Jewish that he was working with. So I don't know. I think Nochlyn's argument is that Joyce and Proust are examples of authors who draw out something non-critical in Jewishness, or like something in Jewishness that is essential, that is going beyond the boundaries of stereotype or type. Again, I think it's limited. I don't know if it's possible. I've never come across, but again, I've also never read a whole author's corpus like I have with Nabokov. So I could say for one author, one novel it could be, but then I don't know what else they've written, and maybe it's just a one-off. So not a very good answer, but an answer, hopefully.
No, it's fine. It's a good answer. Barbara.
Hi, hello. That was a really interesting talk, Julie. Thank you. I just had a couple of thoughts while you were talking about the function of the metaphors in the text and how they can also be seen as distancing tools, that they distance Humbert from the activity, but also the reader, because it's turning this activity into something abstract, poetic, and imagistic, which then relates to whether this imagery can be converted into cinema. And obviously it's very difficult to do that. I mean, Nabokov tried to do it in his screenplay. The screenplay is full of, you know, the kind of very, very flowery sort of descriptions of things that couldn't possibly be filmed in a serious way. You know, you would end up with something quite, you know, extravagant and really unwatchable for contemporary audiences. And that was Kubrick's dilemma, that he had to sort of then try and handle all of that and break it down into something that was workable. And obviously Kubrick was having to function under really strict censorship, which then plays into the whole dynamic between Humbert and Lolita. How do you represent that and get through the censors? So, and ultimately, these directors have their own take on something. As you say, it's an adaptation. I was disappointed by Line's film because I thought that by that point in our cultural history that it would be possible to show the horror of the movie in a more explicit way, and they failed to do that. They romanticized the relationship, you know, in an extreme way, but I think, you know, there is always this issue that the textual metaphors are very, very difficult to translate without a piece of film becoming like something out of a 1920s silent movie, you know. But it's very, I mean, there's certainly a lot more to sort of think about in terms of that. Whether anybody will actually be able to achieve something that's truer to the novel in film, I really, really don't know. So that was just some thoughts.
And thank you very much for your thoughts. I think that the problem for the movie, it's not that, yes, of course, it's difficult to adapt some metaphors, but I think the main problem is that the directors thought that it was a love story, a shared love story. So it's a at the beginning, it's a misinterpreting. And I think in the Kubrick movies, there is a lot of interesting metaphor, as the chess metaphor, for example. And this is the point of, I'm sorry, my English is very difficult for me, but I think that if the point of view that he shows on the movie were different, we could understood the metaphor differently. And for Lines, the problem is the same, that he thinks that it's a shared love story, but he tries some metaphor, but it was too literal. So it has the it's like it's a planing the metaphor. I don't know if it's the good term, but yes, of course it's difficult, but if you can't do it, I think you shouldn't adapt Lolita for cinema.
Julie, do you think that it can be done? I mean, I've always thought that it was kind of an impossible task to get at. You mentioned that sort of tension between denouncing and adopting Humbert's point of view, and that's something that is so much of the meaning of the book is about the reader's struggle between, you know, denunciation and also being sort of drawn in and wooed by Humbert's wit and humor, and so I wonder how a film, the camera, you know, oftentimes is the point of view, and we can see that in Kubrick, how sometimes, you know, the way things are shot, we see Sue Lyon's, you know, legs, and then the camera sort of moves down her, and there's like a sexy music in the background, and so we do get a little bit of Humbert's, you know, point of view there, but there's no countervailing kind of discomfort, you know, and so I just wonder, have you imagined a way that a filmmaker could make a film of Lolita?
Yes, I think first of all, I don't think that cinema has limitation in its form, and I think that as a director, that I'm not a cinema director, so but I think you have to make some choices. And the choices you made, like for example, this is the reason why I spoke about the Ridley Scott, The Last Duel, because it's our Rashomon, because it shows us three versions of one story, it shows us different point of view. So I think, for example, for Lolita, we can maybe create this kind of different point of view. One of it's the one of Humbert, maybe with more of voiceover from him, that it takes the spectator to the movie and to the Humbert's voice, and another point of view, assumed one, not like in the movies of Kubrick's and Line. One point of view is the real one of Lolita, that we have to imagine it, but and to show the horror and maybe the other side of the metaphor, that is the nightmare one. It could be like that, for example, the dream one by Humbert and the nightmare one, like, and we can create a lot of, this is the reason why I don't think cinema has limitation. I think here directors had the limitation of male gaze. So this is here that we can find the limitation, but not on the medium itself.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Barbara.
Sorry, I just want to say just one more thing. I guess the limitation with cinema is the industry itself, and,
yes.
and where these directors are actually placed within the industry. I mean, Kubrick, by that stage, a pretty central Hollywood director, you know, with a reputation, and Line also, you know, very much a Hollywood director. And they're not trying to make art films, and you know, you'd have to. Lynch, for example, if you've been thinking about David Lynch would have done an amazing job on it. He's the sort of person who could really, you know, tease out all this stuff. But it's for a very particular audience. And I suppose the limitations with these directors is that they were very much mainstream and having to please, you know, the studios and mainstream audiences. So there are these things that get in the way, essentially, you know. So
yeah, I totally agree.
May I just say also that Adrian Lyne had a career in advertising as well. For me, that seemed very powerful when I saw the it just looked like a kind of commercial take on the thing rather than a literary take on.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Sorry, we're getting reverb on my audio.
Is it?
Oh, is somebody need to mute? Linda?
Yes. I'm sorry. I hate to see my face on the video, but I just would like to say that I am 80 years old and a great fan of Vladimir Nabokov's work. I also spent I spent 27 years advocating for abused children in the Vermont child and family system and in the courts. And on the one hand, I want to say that the unreliable narrator of Humbert Humbert is not popularly acknowledged as unreliable by most readers, and the films do nothing, absolutely nothing, to correct that, the gravity of that error. An independent filmmaker, possibly a woman, who is able to tease out the suffering that Lolita experiences, and the fact, as Vera told one reporter, she cries herself to sleep every night, and she clearly has never felt any kind of love, partly because of her stage of development, as well as the fact that her needs were never met by this monster that inserted his penis into her body over and over and over again for 5 years, and comes to her in the end with offers of money and appears to have genuine feelings for her, such that he overcomes his dislike of older women's bodies, as if that is some kind of a corrective statement that gives people permission to see Humbert Humbert as a genuine lover, when he is a case of arrested development. Also, a close reading of Lolita reveals at least 5 or 6 hospitalizations in mental hospitals because of breakdowns that he's had. And he clearly has his need for approval is his dominant theme in writing the manuscript for his psychiatrist in prison. And one thing that I just want to close with is there is one mention in the book of picking up sanitary pads at a store when they stop. And there is absolutely no explanation, despite Humbert's fantasy of sometime producing possibly another generation of Lolitas, is how and in what way birth control is practiced over this period of time. There's no reference to it, with all of Nabokov's research into prepubescent children and their psyches and their preferences for superficiality and candy and movie magazines. There's not a single reference of to the a child menstruating and how she avoids getting pregnant. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. So glad you're here. Anyone else? All right. If not, we will give one last round of silent applause to our presenters. And I want to thank you all again for coming. This was really stimulating and inspiring event. And I'm so glad that you took this time out of your schedules to be with us. Thanks, everybody.
And thank you for organizing it again, Matt, and thank you to both speakers. Thank you.
Of course.